Hello class, and welcome to session 13 of Multicultural Ministry, and this week we're talking about shared power. Shared power has to do with inviting others to the table of decision making. Oftentimes we assume that those of us at the top understand what is best for others. So we want to talk about what it looks like to invite others in the process of decision making. Oftentimes churches pattern themselves off of corporate models or government models which are hegemonic or make decisions from the top down, assuming that, like I said, they know what's best for everyone else. We should never assume that we understand all the subtle nuances of other cultures, and always make space for others to represent themselves in decision making. So we invite others to the table. Remember, that's the highest form of cultural inclusion, to say to other people, what do you think? How can this event best reflect the realities of your culture? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk about inviting others around the table and why that's important as it reflects a biblical model of community. We'll try to familiarize ourselves with the subtle differences between groups that create space for misunderstanding, which is huge. Sometimes we'll do all the right things, but because of a lack of cultural understanding, subtle differences in behavior may create misunderstanding between people, like the use of time, or the use of space, or body movements, or things like eye movements, eye contact, or the lack of eye contact, and what that might mean for various cultures. The difference between blinks and winks could be very, very subtle and meaningful depending on what culture you belong to. And they all make cross-cultural situations somewhat tense when there's a misunderstanding about what these things mean. Some cultures hug and kiss. Other cultures avoid those things. And when those types of things are used, they may send messages to others that are confusing and create tension in meetings. There are also things like distinct gender roles. In America, we push for equality, or at least we try to, in terms of gender roles, but gender roles are very distinct. And so we'll talk about somewhat of a history on gender roles and how gender is modeled and somewhat forced into the minds of kids in the use of gendered toys, and how they help to shape the roles that children have as they grow up. We'll also look at some societies and the differences between those societies as we compare some societies that are more masculine than societies that are feminine. There are actually societies whose makeup is more masculine. Some are more feminine. Some avoid uncertainty and they are hesitant to take risks. What cultures are they? And it may be difficult in church situations to present opportunities for people to do things that may be considered as as taking a risk, as being risky. Some groups are by nature kind of hesitant towards risk taking. So we need to think about that. Who are these groups and how does that work? Then we'll compare models of diversity. There are some who see differences between people as superficial, and there's really no difference. For others, difference is substantial, but they believe it should be minimized. It's there, but let's try and suppress and minimize it. There may be others that say that differences in cultures can be utilized, that we can use the differences in other people for the benefit of the whole, while others insist that space needs to be made for differences, whether or not they're perceived to have any value or not, that we need to be inclusive of all cultures and make space for them all. So we'll take a little time to look at that. Then we'll talk about how dominant groups often have a tendency to mute the voices of those on the margins, and how that works. What is the name of that phenomenon? We'll talk about that. And in order for people to avoid their voices being muted, they respond in certain ways. And so we'll look at assimilation from that perspective, and how assimilation might be the reaction of non-assertive people to say, well, rather than fighting for my voice being heard, I'll simply assimilate to the dominant culture and not uphold my rights. Whereas others may separate and create communities to themselves or groups to themselves that are very assertive, saying we're going to uphold our own rights in our own community. And then you have others that are aggressive, those that seek for accommodation, that space needs to be made for us, that is recognized by both the dominant groups and others. And so those more aggressive groups fight for the rights of all people to be respected and heard. Then we'll end with a review of some ideas, including some ideas that come from Lingenfelter's book. And the forum this week challenges you to think about how change happens. And so look at that and have some conversation with one another. And I look forward to reading your post and also to see you next week. God bless.